Just before we begin, I would like to kindly remind our audience, we will have a 20 to 30-minute moderated Q&A. Everyone will be muted for this part of the program. Following from this, we will proceed to questions from the audience, and questions can be asked via the chat function. You'll be invited to address your questions to the panel, and the host will unmute you so that you can ask your question. And lastly, feel free to share your videos. Firstly, I'd like to invite you, Keishi, to please give an introduction of yourself to the audience.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. So my name is Keishi Chalakramesh and I'm fortunate to be the Multicultural Youth Commissioner at the moment. So I'm second gen Sri Lankan, so was born in Australia but parents migrated over here about 30 years ago. My day job's as a legal advisor and my other job is as Commissioner. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Keishi. Next, I would like to welcome Councillor Mi Lin.
Thank you, Kenny. My name is Mi Lin Chenyu May. I am a councillor on the City of Yarra. I'm currently the Deputy Mayor. I am also a second generation Australian, so my parents likewise migrated here, similarly about 30, 40 years ago. And for a day job, I work for the Centre of Innovative Justice with RMIT. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Lin. And finally, I'd like to welcome Andrew Giles.
Thanks, Kenny. It's great to be here and great to be part of such a fantastic panel. I'm a lawyer by background, which sounds like everyone on the panel, and I've been in the Federal Parliament as a Labor member since 2013. Since the last election, I've had the great privilege of being Labor's spokesperson for multicultural affairs.
Thanks, Andrew. I'd like to just quickly acknowledge that Viv Nguyen, BMC Chair, is joining us here today, as well as Councillor Damien Nguyen of City of Yarra and Andrew Doe, the Chairperson of the Advisory Board of DILP and the Deputy Chairperson of the VCA Vic. So thank you for joining us here today. Tonight we will address the challenges that young people are experiencing in these unprecedented times and the response to these challenges. We're going to address a number of issues around COVID, such as the impact of prejudice and discrimination, as well as issues around leadership, fair representation, and how that can help address similar issues in the future. So firstly, we will address the circumstances and impacts of COVID. COVID has undoubtedly created and exacerbated the fear, which is a key element to racism and xenophobia. Keishi, we see a lot of reports in both Australia and across the world of people from predominantly Asian backgrounds being targeted by overt forms of racism during COVID. Does this reflect what you are seeing and hearing in your role as a Youth Commissioner? And what avenues are there to address this issue?
Yeah, definitely rings true. I was fortunate to chair a youth roundtable last week where I heard a lot of these issues. And one of the big ones was racism, but there's a lot of other ones that are going on, including, employment, as if it wasn't hard enough for a lot of multicultural youth to find employment. Now there's increased barriers, as well as, casual workers getting reduced hours, payments being difficult to navigate. There's also issues in terms of international students having concerns about their visas, about financial security, about housing security, food security, stress on multicultural youth who need to help their parents navigate different systems such as payments and stimulus packages, family relying on multicultural youth for translations, which increases, the stress for these guys. A lack of mental health services was one that I was really interested to hear about. A lot of them were saying that telehealth was quite difficult to access, keeping in mind that parents and family members were nearby, and that lack of confidentiality that sort of surrounds that. And there's a lot of young people losing faith in government. So losing faith in systems due to confusing messaging, information being difficult to access, and definitely racism is one of the big ones. I think that, safety is something that should be absolutely predominant in our state. And it's really disappointing to hear that people are being racially attacked over this.
Thanks, Keishi. Mealy, just touching on the topic of racism, we know that it's been more overt due to COVID. And we know that Asian Australians and other multicultural backgrounds daily experience individual and systemic racism in Australia. Have you personally faced these issues and how have you dealt with it? And what ways can we begin to address the more systematic issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is. I echo the sentiments of Keishi just before. I think racism is systemic, but it's also quite subtle and prolific. And it's just the way that I've personally been treated differently, but not even realizing that I've been treated differently because of my race. So one really simple example is that I was often recommended when I was applying for jobs after I graduated to change my name because I had my full name, Meilin Chen May. And it was suggested to me that that's probably one of the reasons why I wasn't being employed. And so I actually made the decision not to change my name. I wasn't lucky enough after, quite some time of job hunting in a tough market to get a job. But just even that being suggested to me a couple of times really raised my awareness of it. And look, I think one of the best ways to overcome it is really to be strong in yourself and be proud of where you're from and not think that that is a deficiency or that you are valued any less than that. And one way to do that is really to connect to your culture and community and understand it rather than being embarrassed by it. Don't let anyone embarrass you by who you are. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about DILP. I wasn't lucky enough in my youth to grow up with community members around me. I grew up in Geelong. My family was one of the first Chinese families in Geelong. We were a novelty. So I didn't really have that experience being surrounded by cousins and a community who really supported and, really could appreciate some of the situations I was going through. And being able to understand what that meant. I sometimes grew up thinking that was me, but I think having established some really great connections, even with my colleagues and working in particular with Dan Nguyen on council, having another Asian colleague has really given me the confidence to speak up and recognise in myself when I need to be confident in my own culture and representing that.
Thanks. And so as a deputy mayor, how has the Yarra City Council or local government looked to address these issues with a particular focus on young people?
Council has done this in a couple of ways. So I'm on the Multicultural Advisory Committee, something I am very passionate about. I think one of the most exciting things for me being on council has been able to represent the multicultural community. I remember campaigning, and for the first time, I was door knocking in North Richmond in particular, and people looking at me, Vietnamese people, Timorese people looking at me and thinking, I can relate to you. You can represent me. You're someone I could talk to if I have a problem. And that was just so, that sense of responsibility and duty really meant so much to me. But in terms of the City of Yarra, we're passionate about multiculturalism. We do that in a couple of ways, which is one, through celebrating multiculturalism. So one of our biggest celebrations is the Lunar Festival at the start of the year. It's probably the biggest event that we run in the year, and we're big supporters of that. And we have other festivals such as the Johnson Street Fiesta, but really celebrating culture and facilitating the celebration and acceptance of multiculturalism through celebration. The other way we do it, because we've got quite a new migrant population through our public housing tenants, is through a capacity building program that we have. And this really targets racism. It's an information, so education and capacity building program called We Stand Together, where we build and educate community leaders of various ethnic groups about what the law is on racism, how they can report it, and also where they can find services to get help. So they can go back to their community and be leaders in their community and pass on that information. So that's one example of how we tackle racism in the City of Yarra.
Yeah, I understand, like, having events from various multicultural backgrounds and including people is actually one of the best ways, or one of the good ways, to actually engage the whole community. Andrew, at a federal level, what needs to happen to ensure that these challenges can be addressed in the future, and so that we can respond more appropriately?
In the first instance, we need the government to accept that we've got a national responsibility, not just to say nice things about multiculturalism, but to fight for it. And I think we see that at the moment, and most obviously with the increase of racism, and particularly that which has been directed against Asian Australians through COVID. And I'm struck by two things, really. We haven't actually engaged in combating racism at a national level since the Racism It Stops With Me campaign back in 2012. Funding for that stopped in 2015. And since then, we know that racism and Islamophobia and anti-Semitism have all increased. And we're seeing the consequences of that every day. So in the first instance, I think we need the national government to take this seriously, and not just to say sorry after events, after racist attacks, but to take active steps to stop those attacks from taking place in the first place. I think there's a couple of other things around this, and in federal Labor, we've been calling for two things. We've been calling for a public education campaign at a national level, very much along the lines that we were just hearing about within the City of Yarra, about building capacity and building awareness amongst cultural and linguistically diverse communities, but across the entire community, to understand what racism is, the damages that it does to individuals and to our whole community, and to build a collective sense of responsibility to build a safe community, to defend all of our community. But the other thing I think we need to do is to take a bit of a deeper look at racism in Australia, and to understand a bit more about what's going on, what's driving it, and what are the consequences. Because as well as the very obvious and horrifying incidents, and we need to know more about them, we don't properly track them. That's something that Chin Tan has spoken a bit about as Race Discrimination Commissioner. I think it's important that we understand the more subtle forms of exclusion, the pressures that people feel, the anxieties that prevent them from entering public space or from putting their hand up for positions, including public office. So I think we need to do some urgent steps to counter the racism that's ongoing in society today. But we also need to commit to taking a deep look at what is happening in our society so that we can take a more structural approach to ending racism.
Yeah, totally agree. So one of the ways to ensure a more culturally appropriate response is to have better representation, whether that is in media, politics, or public office. More broadly speaking, we have an audience today of predominantly young Vietnamese Australians who, when they look around in the community, see little to no representation of people from their own cultural backgrounds in senior leadership positions. As our panel of speakers, each of you hold significant and senior leadership positions representing our community. So my question firstly to Keishi, why do you think this is the case, and how do you think we can see more young people of multicultural backgrounds in leadership roles?
Yeah, I think it's definitely hard. Like, this was exactly my experience growing up. So for those of you who don't know me, like, I'm speaking to you now from Bendigo, which is my hometown, which is regional Victoria. So Bendigo literally used to have the reputation of being the whitest town. So when I moved here, when I was like 4 or so, there was hardly anyone here from a different culture or different faith. So that was really difficult. And, you know, that sort of inspired me to go on to be more visible, I guess, in whatever I went on to do in future. I think in terms of facilitating leadership potential and ensuring that young people have a voice, I think there's sort of 3-ish steps to doing it. So the first one is letting the everyday leadership that's already going on. I think we get really caught up in, you know, you have to be in a program, you have to be in a specific position in order to be a leader. But there's so much that, like, you know, young multicultural youth are doing already, such as, you know, explaining things to their community. If they can understand English and understand all of the current messages that are going on, just even translating that is an act of leadership. Listening to their community, listening to concerns and helping people out, that's also leadership. So making sure that young people are actually being recognized for doing the everyday leadership they're doing. Next is probably encouraging youth to get involved in the networks they can see around them. So there's multicultural advocacy networks. So for example, the VMC is going to be kickstarting the Multicultural Youth Network sometime soon. So that'll be really exciting, doing stuff like that, which leads to grassroots advocacy and policy change later on. Joining online groups, discussions that are talking about taking stands against racism, supporting their peers in advocacy efforts. I'm really excited from that youth roundtable to see how many people are, you know, doing stuff off their own back and getting involved in programs and creating them, but also reaching out to other young leaders and sharing info and networks. But I think there's also a lot of work to be done in terms of organizations and influencing them to involve multicultural youth in discussions and campaigns, you know, encouraging young people to share their experiences and stories on the platforms, and definitely doing a bit of that capacity training for young people to be able to advocate for their own communities.
There's definitely a lot of things that we can get involved in. Can I just go back to your motivation to take on a leadership position? Actually, in particular, what role or strength do you think your dual identity played in your leadership journey?
It was just being the middleman, which was great. And I think a lot of, from what I've heard of DILP, you guys focus a lot on this, which is, you know, you're the middle ground between the culture that you've brought here and also the culture you're adapting to. And sometimes that can be hard, because for me, I felt like I didn't really fit in, because when I went to Sri Lanka, they knew that I wasn't from there. And obviously from here, like it's quite obvious that I'm not Caucasian. So that was difficult, but it's also such an asset to be able to be the intermediary between two different cultures. So I think definitely it's been a really good advocacy tool for me, because I can go into Sri Lankan networks and, you know, really associate with them and really relate to them, as well as any sort of second culture kid who's kind of caught in the middle, but also talking to, you know, Australian communities and the people in positions of privilege right now. Being able to level with both sides, I think, has been really instrumental in my own leadership journey and being able to reconcile both sides.
I'll just quickly go to Andrew. Andrew, this marks the 45th year of the settlement of the Vietnamese community in Victoria, and we have yet to have any individual identifying with a Vietnamese background elected to Parliament. What changes do you think can be made to better encourage individuals of diverse multicultural backgrounds to seek a leadership position?
I probably should acknowledge Sang Nguyen, who was in the Victorian Upper House for a period of time in the 90s. But the point you make goes way beyond any individual. I guess I might make two observations. One as the Labor Party spokesperson for multicultural affairs, and one a bit about what the Labor Party, I think, could and should be doing to rectify the imbalance in representation. The first one is, I see the role that I have and the role of any spokesperson in government around multicultural issues is not to speak for any multicultural communities, but to ensure that there is public space and appropriate private space for the entire diversity of the Australian and the Victorian community to access, and to break down, having first identified through listening what those barriers are. And I think the same thing goes to creating space for people to assume representative and leadership roles. And you know, what Casey said is an incredibly powerful statement, and I'm really glad that it's been recorded, because I hope it's something that people can come back to. But one of the things that I think we have not done very well in the Labor Party, and probably in Australian society, is firstly measuring our diversity. I think Australia is unusual amongst multicultural societies in not really keeping any meaningful records of ethnic background and involvement in life. And this is something that I know Tim South-Thomas-Hahn was very passionate about when he was the Race Discrimination Commissioner. It's something that I'm very concerned about. One of the ways in which in any organisation you drive performance is by setting targets. And I think we see how effective that's been within my party when it comes to affirmative action for women. And similarly, more recently, in terms of ensuring that First Nations people are represented in proportion in the parliament to the population. We haven't done as well when it comes to multicultural Australia. We haven't done as well in particular with the Vietnamese community. I think the answer to that is multifaceted. One of the things that we have done in Victoria is build a diversity fellowship program to try and put in place a program within our party to identify people, to bring them together with other young multicultural leaders in the party, and to engage them in all the ways that we think are appropriate to both shape their leadership journeys, but also, and possibly more importantly, to reshape our culture so that we can identify some of the barriers culturally within the party that are preventing people of talent from the full diversity of backgrounds from finding their way through into public office. So I might stop at that point, Kenny, because I could keep probably talking for the rest of the Zoom, but if there are more direct questions, obviously I'm really keen to come back to them and hear what people have to say.
Before I just quickly go to Meilin, I would like to remind the audience to please send through your questions through the Zoom chat, and we will select you to address your question to our panel personally. So Meilin, I just want to quickly touch on, with council elections coming up this year, what message do you have for young people about this, and how can we begin to increase diversity at local politics?
Very simple. If you're interested in running, you should run, and it is a valuable and experience, even if it's just for the experience, to be engaged. I think DILP members and your community, the Vietnamese community, is already connected to your own identity and community, which is such a strong foundation for you to represent and run for elections. So if I were to advise any of you, it would be have the courage to run and give it a go. It's an experience that will educate you on, public process, public life, and will also be something that you can pass on to other members of your community. I think it's also important, like I feel this responsibility that you need to show other members that it's possible, other members of your community it's possible. So that if for any other reason, if you have the courage to do it, I'd recommend it.
Thanks, Meilin. I think Tien has a question, so I would like to invite Tien to quickly ask his question.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to ask if we are subject to or witness an act of racism, how can we respond safely and productively?
Keishi?
Yeah, I think this is something that I've been trying to rack my brains about, because it's not always safe to do so. And I think we need to really prioritize each other's safety. But I think from a very high level, in an ideal world, we'd have a culture where it's safe and ideal to report these things. But I think from a practical point of view, reporting it to the Equal Opportunities and Human Rights Commission, reporting it to VicPol, because as Andrew was saying earlier, like, data is power, and that's what we're really lacking in a lot of this thing. It's that reliable data that we can really use to influence government and that we can really use to influence policy. So we need people to, as hard as it is and as vulnerable as a space as it feels, we need people to report it so we can actually have accurate data and accurate records of what's going on. And I think that's really how we can get to change. It all stems from a culture, and creating this culture where it's okay to stand up and to say that this is wrong, but also ensuring that we're aware of all the different types of racism that happens. And I think a few of the other panelists have touched on this, which is, racism might be an outright comment, or it could be one of those little biases, employment biases. It could be a joke, an offhand comment, anything. Just making sure that we feel comfortable calling it out. Because I had a similar experience to what was recounted before. Where in high school, I was told the FSET qualification on like my LinkedIn profile, which is the English exam. And for me, I was like, I was born in Griffith. Like, my English is not that bad. So I don't think I need to put a qualification on there for it. But I had it on there up until really recently. It was only until a couple of years ago that I felt the courage to take it off, because even though I felt strong in my position as someone who's a multicultural advocate, it was still nerve-wracking to think that someone out there who doesn't know me might, assume something about me that might put me behind the pack. So I think, yeah, it's a lot about cultural change and enforcing that. But in the meantime, support it.
Andrew, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, look, I mean, the safety point is a really important one. I had an email from someone in Queensland who was very upset at how a complaint that they had made had been dealt with by the police. And these are the things that really worry me because for the reasons that Cassie just said, we need people to report incidents if we're going to build a case for change. But obviously we also want to make sure that people are kept safe. I would encourage everyone to report anything to the Human Rights Commission and to the Victorian Equal Opportunity Commission. And I'd also direct people to a tracker that's been run by a group of people in the Asian Australian Leadership Network, which is trying to build a clear picture of racism through COVID in Australia. And perhaps, Kenny, rather than me try and read out scribble now, I might send you those details that you might be able to send around the network, because that is a very safe way that people could share their experiences, not perhaps put themselves into a position that they might want to feel comfortable in, but help us build a clearer picture of what's going on and who's being affected by what.
Thanks, Andrew. Maylene, did you have anything to add before we go to the next?
No, I think it was covered that it's cultural, and it does depend on the context. If it's a street scenario, obviously, I think Andrew would have pointed out, safety is always should be first. But I think also just taking stock and being proud of your culture, that's the best shield to racism in my experience as well. Just realising that whatever's thrown at you is not, it's not really about you, it's about them. But if it's in a different nuanced situation where it's an employment or you're discriminated against something that you have a right to, that's very difficult and should be reported. There is no justification in that scenario, and you should always fight that fight.
Thank you. I would like to invite Alyssa to ask her question.
Thanks, Kenny. So my question is, I guess to any of you can answer this. So I'm a young adult, but obviously there's some youth on here too. If we see someone experiencing racism happening due to the COVID-19 or other reasons that create racism, what can we do to support that person or community facing racism?
Andrew, perhaps?
Yeah, well, look, I think going back a little bit over old ground, but I think if people can feel solidarity when the incident takes place, if it's safe for others to intervene, that's the most powerful thing. Well, second most powerful thing, I think Maylene put it so well a minute ago about not allowing acts of racism to diminish pride. But I think, so if you're a witness, if it's safe to demonstrate solidarity, to push back against the racism, to show the person who is the victim, if it's not you, that the conduct is unacceptable. And again, if it is at all possible, to raise it with the appropriate bodies, which are the Human Rights Commission, the Equal Opportunity Commission in Victoria, and Victoria Police.
Thanks, Andrew. I think, yeah, what we saw between the South Sudanese and the Vietnamese community last year or the year before that was the leaders of each community got together and actually supported each other, which was good to see. Was there anything else that you wanted to add, Maylene or Katie?
I'll jump in. I think even in instances where it's not safe, it doesn't hurt to validate the person going through it, because I think it's really easy to think that you're the problem, or to let it go unchecked, in which case you build this sort of idea that, you know, people treating you a certain way is normal. So I think even if you can't intervene with the person doing it, or it's not safe, I think just checking in with the person who's experienced it and just saying to them, like, hey, I saw this happen, it wasn't on, you shouldn't be treated that way, blah, blah, blah. At least it validates the experience in that person's mind. They know it's just not in their head, per se.
I'll quickly ask Long to ask his question.
Hey everyone, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Number one, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time out and joining us on this panel today. It's really awesome to kind of see people from different levels within our community come and speak to us. So my question is, and it kind of took a bit of time to think through it. But I feel like a lot of multicultural discussions, I've seen that this sometimes it seems implicit that multiculturalism means people of color, and in the discussion we often, well not often, but sometimes we'll rail against white people or Caucasian people, and I feel like this is not in the spirit of what multiculturalism is. And so I guess I wanted to hear about your experiences. Is this a trap that we fall into when we speak about multiculturalism? And what are the impacts of this? Does this alienate potential allies we have in this conversation?
Sorry, I know I'm picking you, Andrew. I'll go to you first.
No, look, I think it's a really profound question. So thanks for raising it. If I could answer it, I probably wouldn't have the word shadow before my job title, though. I might just make a couple of really brief observations. One is that I think if you look at all the survey evidence, Australians across the board think very positively of multiculturalism, but when you sort of scratch below it, they often have very different senses of what multiculturalism is. And I think that's something that we've got to explore, and that's got to be a conversation led by Multicultural Australia today. Because the other thing I'm really conscious of, I don't think we've had a proper governmental consideration of multicultural policy since Paul Keating was Prime Minister, which probably is before the majority of people on this Zoom were born. And Australia today is a very different country than it was in the early to mid-90s. And I think we should open up this conversation, because I think we really need to hear new voices, the voices of emerging communities and of emerging leaders within more established communities, to tease out this, because there are divergent views on, what is multiculturalism, indeed whether multiculturalism is the framework that we should be engaging with, or others. So, I don't have the answers to this, but I think part of my job is, again, creating an informed and engaged conversation in which all affected stakeholders get to have the say. Because again, we shouldn't, one of the things that I think is a real trap in this debate, and I see it whenever I do an interview about racism and I get my Facebook inbox filled with racist remarks, is I think Australian identity is clearly, I think, not something that's set in stone. It's being made every day, every time someone makes their life here, decides to become a citizen, tells their story, shares their culture. And I think with that in mind, we can't just think about that as in the broad. We've got to also think about whether our multicultural institutions are fit for purpose. And I think in FECA in particular, we've seen a real recognition of that we need, that they've brought in so many younger faces. And sorry, I'm probably going on so long, but it is such a profound question. And I think it's one that we shouldn't be afraid to really work through, and see if a consensus that can be reached across Multicultural Australia as to exactly what it is we are talking about when we say we like multiculturalism.
Maylene, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think it is a very interesting point. Multiculturalism does get us widely associated with food and music, and we do get into traps of simplifying what it means, and when it really essentially means embracing differences in different cultures. But I think the history of it is about a power imbalance and a power struggle. It's about majority and minority, and sometimes we fall into that trap. But I agree with you. I think it's a responsibility of people who are proud of their culture to not fall into that trap, and not have that undertone of resentment, because I think that diminishes your value as well. So just really being proud of who you are and accepting that, and also embracing others.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Viv Nguyen to please ask your question.
Thanks for that, Chair. Andrew, this is more a question for you. I took part in the panel with Tim Soot from Masang, and he made a statement that really drove home to me around the complexity of racism that is manifesting itself in Australia these days as a result of COVID-19. And he said, in Australia, we can't identify, we can't differentiate between our attitude towards anti-China, anti-Chinese, or anti-Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party. And they were his quote. And it really drove home to me. And that's what's really manifesting itself in our society these days. Do you have any observation on that and any solution at a federal level, if any? Thank you.
Yeah, Viv, I think it's again a really important question right now. But my short answer is I agree with Tim. I am really anxious at the way in which people are conflating criticism of decisions of the Chinese government or the CCP with racist attacks on people who are ethnically Chinese. And it should be possible in our democracy to be able to separate the two. I am very, very worried that a number of political figures, Pauline Hanson is a prominent example, but there are others who are engaging in quite a bit of dog whistling in this space. And I think there does need to be a really clear correction. And, I think the Prime Minister and indeed Minister Tudge have made some very strong statements in response to racist attacks, and I've welcomed those. But I think we need more than just responses. We need a really clear articulation of a commitment on the part of the Australian National Government to stand up for every Australian and to recognise that there is a group within our community right now who are feeling very, very anxious, and they've got good reason to feel anxious, and are not receiving the protection I think that they are entitled to, and we should all expect in a decent society.
Thank you, Andrew. I just wanted to go to a very interesting question from Jordan Basilius.
Hi, first, thank you for this amazing discussion today. My question was essentially, how can we manage the task of being really proud of our minority cultures, but at the same time, tackling sexism and homophobia, which does exist within minority communities, and do that in a way which creates real change?
Firstly, go to Katie.
Yeah, I think this is where that intermediary sort of position comes in. I've come up against this personally with my communities of, I find that a lot of the migrants who have come over from Sri Lanka, people from anywhere really, they cling on to their culture as best they can, and they cling on to their values and their morals, and some of those practices and traditions don't exactly align with modern day values, which is always a really difficult spot to be in. But I think it's finding the sweet spot between what you love about your culture and then what you love about the culture you're adopting, and these sorts of views on like modern takes on sexism and on homosexuality, taking those modern stances and seeing how you can respectfully bring it back to your culture. Like, I think it's definitely an art to blend the two together, but it's something that can be done, because every time a new generation comes about, there's going to be new ideals, there's going to be a new way forward and something modern. And I see it as somewhat of a responsibility that we have as the intermediary to bring these newer ideas to the older generations, and ensuring that you can do what you can to help them. But I think there's definitely a skill in acknowledging that, just because someone has a view that's not in line with what's modern right now, it's come from a particular context and experience and a lens that they've gone through. So it's not outright being like arguing. I used to do it with my parents all the time. I used to say to my parents, like, oh, why do you have this view that's so annoying? Like, that's not right. But that's not the way to go about it. It's that they've gone through certain experiences in their life that have caused them to have this view, and you've had different experiences. So it's more, I think, a storytelling and a story sharing narrative than what it is an argument. And I think that sometimes you can reach a really good balance where you tell your side of things and you can really bring about real change by having those little moments where you share humanity about a particular issue that you're passionate about.
Definitely. And this is the kind of discussion that the Dual Identity Leadership Program touches on. Mei-Lin, from a similar background, from a Chinese background, sorry, how would you like to add anything to that?
I think Kashi has said it so beautifully in terms of that is the unique and beautiful role that we have as first, second generations Australians, that you're the intermediary, and you almost have this responsibility to play a role in your community and play a leadership role, but doing it obviously very sensitively and with care, and that's what makes multicultural people, well, I shouldn't say the word multicultural, but new migrant people, first generation, second generation Australians, such well-rounded leaders. And it's a dynamic of having to navigate those two worlds that make you so dynamic. So I think it's just, this question is just another reason why DILP should exist, as you've already pointed out, Kenny, that the capacity building and empowering of young leaders is so essential in this task. And I think it is such a unique and important role that young people have to play.
Thanks, Milin. I'd like to go to Celia Tran's question.
Hi everyone, thank you so much to the panelists for sharing your insights. I guess my question was around young people and their role that they play in civic engagement. We're noticing more than ever in our community that young people are not engaging in politics, choosing not to vote because they're feeling that their voices aren't heard, and there's no avenues to be heard. How do we ensure that we don't continue down this trajectory? And also, will we be seeing a federal youth minister in our time? There's a real hesitance, it feels, towards having youth representation or a youth voice even in Parliament. And this question's to anybody. Thank you.
Andrew?
Okay, well, maybe on the last bit, if Labor had been successful at the last election, we'd have a youth minister. We had a youth minister throughout the previous Labor governments. Tony Abbott abolished it. Neither Malcolm Turnbull nor Scott Morrison have brought it back. We've got a shadow minister. It's something we take very seriously. I think the wider question is such an important one, Celia, though, about how we better engage young people, and I guess recognises, as Jordan's question raised as well, the intersectional dynamics here, that the more people carry attributes which, push them away from having power in society, the less likely they are to be engaged in the political process, the more likely they are to be cynical about it. And that's a huge challenge for anyone who plays any leadership role in a political party or in civil society. And I think that's probably our biggest challenge at this time of both increasing inequality generally and the prospect of the pandemic and a long recovery increasing that, finding ways to engage young people, particularly those who are disengaged from work or study, and connecting them to a sense of hope and possibility that they can have some say in shaping the world in which they live. I think that's as important a challenge, bar dealing with climate change, as any, encouraging faith in a political process for those who presently aren't doing very well in society.
Milin, Keishi, did you have anything to add?
This is a topic I'm very passionate about. I've been very passionate about on council. I think young people have a lot to say and a lot of value to give in civic participation, especially in decision-making processes. Like, I don't want to sound jaded, but you get to a decision-making position and there's so many interests tied up with owning property, having a mortgage, that really, I think you don't have that aspirational view that you do when you're young. And so then you get situations where we have such intergenerational inequality, where we see our generation who was under pressure because we can't find jobs after graduating. We're not supported. We can't afford houses to buy. And no wonder why civic participation is low, because we're crumbling under the pressure, even after COVID, under this huge debt that we will be paying back. So I think I'm very passionate about this. I talk to my friends about this, be involved. There is no better way. Apathy is the worst position to fall in a time like this. and make it simple, make it easy. Be involved in your community, be involved in your footy club, and influence change in small communities like that, because that, believe me, small communities can grow and they have influence over decision makers and decision making powers. So make sure you're engaged and connect to your community, and I think taking those simple steps will lead you to something bigger.
On the topic of leading change, I'd like to invite Kim Ho to ask her question.
Thank you all, the panelists, so much for your time. It's been really great. So I work in the education space, and we've definitely seen the impacts of COVID-19 more keenly on cold communities, so culturally and linguistically diverse communities that, the impacts are even further compounded for them, just being vulnerable already. And sometimes being further isolated, from confusing systems or messages and processes. So just wondering what, from your perspective, what lessons we can learn from the experience of COVID-19 and what you might personally take forwards in your own work as changes that we can sustain even when we're in the new normal. Thanks.
Really?
Yeah, first of all, the thing that becomes most apparent in a situation, in a pandemic like this, was the amount of information that was coming to us hard and fast. I think everyone was really struggling. I don't think newspapers and news media outlets were more utilised than ever. People were engaged because they needed to understand what the situation was, what the regulations were, and what the response was. For people of a cold background, that it really, I think we were really let down in how that information was really translated and made, and there was no real assurance that we were involved and included in that messaging. So I think if anything what we're to learn in an emergency situation like this is knowing how we reach our cold communities and making sure that we have resources and outlets to make sure that clear information and correct information is fed to them. Australia's Australia's multicultural community has grown so much in the recent years, in the recent 10 years, through migration. I think it's now inexcusable that the government doesn't pay attention to this for future reference, whether that's through media outlets, whether that's through the number of languages that's accessible on their websites. This is something that they definitely need to pay attention to.
Yeah, definitely. Young people have been the hardest here and will be leading into the future. Keisha, is there anything that you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, I think in terms of what this new normal is, I get excited about that term. Like, I know it's a very distressing time at the moment, but the fact that we're considering what a new normal might look like, I think is somewhat exciting, because what I've seen mainly is that things are a lot more accessible than what they seemingly were before. So a lot of jobs that couldn't have been done from home supposedly are now able to be done from home, and a lot of flexible arrangements that weren't previously possible are now possible. So I find that very curious, but also I think that it's going to be a good way forward for a lot of people in the disabled communities, for a lot of people who have child caring responsibilities, for a lot of people who have different jobs that are outside their actual employment job that leave them at home. So I think it's going to be exciting, and I hope that we carry that forward, this attitude that, jobs can be done at home, we can make arrangements, we can do flexi hours, because I think that's how we really help our marginalised communities, is making every concession that we can to make sure that they're included, and that, the workforce is as flexible as what they need it to be for them to effectively participate.
Thank you. So I'll go to our next question, and I note that you all come from a law background. Lynn, you worked at Fitzroy Legal Service. Andrew, you've been a lawyer and you've worked on the Tampa case, helping asylum seekers. So our next question is from Jasmine.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining tonight. It's so lovely to have you here. So it's not just racism, but I think COVID-19 has highlighted the social economic disadvantage that people from refugee, migrant, Indigenous background space, this can include, access to critical information, like in their language, or just like job opportunities, or access to the internet, devices for learning at home, or even educating kids at home, because like some people don't like speak English. And it just, this has just come about because it just seems to be like a battle between prioritizing the health of the economy versus the health of disadvantaged people. Like, do you think this comes about because we have people in power who don't come from these backgrounds? And like, how can we like change that?
Yeah, well, I think the short answer, Jasmine, is yes. But I don't think that's a sufficient answer, really, because I don't think any of our capacity to make good decisions or to empathise or to understand is confined by our background. But I do think the thing that I hope we take away from the pandemic experience, and I'm slightly less optimistic than Kashi is, but is that what the crisis has done is expose a lot of things that weren't working in Australia beforehand. And one of the things that struck me immediately was this issue of engagement of communities where English isn't the first language, where the federal government treated firstly translation of material as an afterthought, and then seemed to think that simply putting a translation on a website is a way of engaging people. And I hope the lesson that we draw from that is there's a broader recognition that equal access to decision making, equal access to information doesn't end with just simply uploading something to a website. It involves active listening and understanding how it is that different people within the community, different groups in the community receive information and communicate. I think you talk about the schools thing too. I mean, one of the things that I'm very concerned about is how the time out of school will push back a lot of kids whose parents may not have a high-level education in English in the Australian school system compared to some of their peers that do. And that's before you get to the issues about access to broadband infrastructure and other issues. So what I hope as the optimistic endpoint is this period of exposing some of the cracks in the system previously is an opportunity for us to really build a new normal in which we really are all in this together, when we make sure that everyone's experience and everyone's circumstances are at the heart of our decision making, not a sort of tick box at the very end of the decision making process.
Keishi?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's really sad that it's an afterthought. And for me, like working in government in my day job, like we had to consider things that we didn't think about before, which is, you know, as a regulator, how do we show empathy to a nation going through a crisis? And I think it's interesting to look at that. But with this question here, I think that people resort to what they're most comfortable with when they problem solve. And I think people in politics at the moment are comfortable talking about the economy. And I think a lot of people are quite comfortable when they think that we have economic stability. But I reckon that if we had people in power who were multicultural and more of them, we might have a more diverse range of thought than just talking about economic measures. But it's definitely something that we need to work on in future, is more representation to ensure that the opinions of many and the experiences of many are actually brought forward, and not just an afterthought, as Andrew was saying. It's something that's really prioritised.
Millie, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, just I guess this is when it really becomes apparent that there are 3 levels of government in Australia. Local government being the closest to the community, state delivering quite localised services, and then the federal government, which tends to make a lot of decisions from Canberra without really understanding what's going on the ground. You know, this is why you get such a focus on economic policy. It's why you get suggestions of drug testing welfare recipients. The disconnect between community and really understanding the effects of policy and the focus on economics, unfortunately. I'm not saying that this is all federal politicians. I'm just saying the remoteness of federal government to community can play out with a focus on economics.
Thanks, Millie. So unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I would like to invite our speakers to would you like to leave any words with the audience before we wrap up?
Oh, look, Kenny, can I just thank you for the opportunity to be part of a really exciting conversation? And Millian, your opening remarks I thought were absolutely amazing. So I hope not only have they been recorded, that we might be able to kind of make use of them in terms of the power of the story that you were telling. So thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Keishi, Millian, did you want to say something before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, thanks for having me. I really love talking at forums like these because the questions are where I learn the most. So I think just thanks to everyone who's asked the questions. They're so interesting to actually look and reflect on, and I think it's something we can all take away and really consider in our professional roles.
Yes, also, well, I always sing the praises of DILP. I think it's an incredible organisation and program. I'd had nothing like this when I was growing up, and I had a sense of social justice. I didn't know where to direct that, so I think it's such a fantastic program, and so well done. It's community owned as well. I'm aware that, you know, all alumni become advisors and you guys end up leading it. So that is the most inspirational part. I'd also like to thank Andrew for also his comments and taking the time, his investment as a federal MP in an all, you know, recognising young people, young Vietnamese people is so good and heartening to see. And Keshi, I've been to a few events with you and have participated alongside you and have also watched you. So I'm always so impressed by your comments and confidence and your leadership. So it's been a really great panel. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank you all again for joining the panel tonight. I'd also like to announce that our next Zoom event will be with Benjamin Law on Wednesday, the 10th of June. We look forward to hosting our next session and we'd like to see everyone there again.